Hello, everyone. I'm Adelaide Reef, Manager of Leadership Development Programs here at Creative Australia. I'm a white woman in my mid-30s with dark brown hair pulled up into a bun, and I'm wearing a black jumper. I'd like to acknowledge the country that I'm dialing in from today. I'm on Gadigal in Moraine, also known as Sydney, and to pay my deep respects to the custodians of this place, custodians of the lands, the waters and the sky of this place, and to thank and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging for their care of this country. And to acknowledge also the lands that you are all dialing in from today, and to share my deep respect to the elders of those places, and also to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us on the webinar today. So this governance conversation series is a collaborative project between Creative Australia and Diversity Arts Australia, designed to explore contemporary and critical issues in arts governance, showcasing ideas, perspectives and approaches that support artists, support communities and those who work with them to thrive. We are grateful to Diversity Arts Australia for their insightful programming, bringing incredible guests from their extended networks into the program. Our thanks to Gurkum Agarulu and Lena Nahlous and the team at DARTS, and also to today's speakers, Tasneem Chopra, OAM, and Dr. Lily Brown, and to the marketing communications team here at Creative Australia as well for making this webinar possible. Please check out other conversations in this series on our website, and you can find recordings of past conversations and register for future sessions on our website as well. A quick reminder as well that our governance program does also include some training opportunities that we are offering in partnership with the Australian Institute for Company Directors. These training opportunities are open for application by individuals and organisations, and the closing date is the 19th of September. For more information, please see the link in the chat and reach out to us via leadershipprogram@creative.gov.au. I'll now hand over to the inimitable Lena, who will be your host for the session today. Lena, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Adelaide. I would also like to respectfully acknowledge the First Peoples of these lands and the various lands we're all zooming in from, and to acknowledge First Peoples' ongoing connections to sky, sea and land, and the rich diversity of First Nations cultures, languages and communities. I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my deepest respects to elders past, present, and the First Nations folks who are joining us today. Thanks for attending today's governance conversation titled Board Representation, Promoting Cultural Safety and Addressing the Power Gap. So, as Adelaide mentioned, I'm Lena Nahlous and I'm hosting these conversations, and I'm also the CEO of Diversity Arts Australia. I'm a middle-aged Arab woman. I have light olive skin, dark brown hair with some grey when I don't dye it, and I'm wearing black rimmed glasses and an orange top. Diversity Arts, or DARTS for short, is Australia's national voice for ethno-cultural and migrant racial equity in the creative sectors, and we're really pleased to be co-hosting these sessions with the newly formed Creative Australia. Yay, bring it on. We're really excited by the ambition of the new body and the work that's going to be up ahead for Creative Australia. So one of our flagship projects at Diversity Arts is the Creative Equity Toolkit, which is a partnership between Diversity Arts and British Council, and which has also had a lot of recent input from First Nations-led company Garawa. So Creative Equity Toolkit is going to really support these conversations. It's a practical, action-based website. It's full of resources that are about supporting topics like governance and organisational culture with practical templates, how-to guides, and you recognising that, of course, equity and governance are really connected, and these topics are really kind of key to tackling racism and promoting equity. Today, we're going to welcome two speakers with an immense wealth of experience, Dr. Lily Brown and Tasneem Chopra, OAM, who I'm going to introduce very soon. I have some housekeeping to get through. Bear with me. I'm going to be as fast as I can. You can contribute to this conversation by asking questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So if possible, we might respond to some of the questions that are put in that Q&A as we go, as in writing, but that might not be possible. We're going to do our best to make space at the end to answer some of those questions, but we're going to see how we go. So please put your questions in the chat. The session's also being recorded, and so you can watch it again, you know, if you don't get to stay for the whole session, or you want to share it with your colleagues, on the events series page on the Creative Australia website. It'll be up there from next week. The session's being captioned and Auslan interpreted. So if you want to turn captions on, go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and turn on show captions. There should be 2 CCs down the bottom, and you can also change the size of the text in the subtitle settings or pop out a window to view the full transcript. And I wanted to thank our Auslan interpreters Tiani Cramp and Kelly Haggie, and also our captioners. So today we're going to be exploring how arts and creative organisations can diversify their boards and overcome historical and structural power imbalances. Like, we are hoping from this that you get some really kind of practical strategies, and kind of you get a bit of inspiration and a little bit of blue sky at the end to think about what the possibilities might be, because it is a really big and weighty and daunting question. We want to ask questions around how having more inclusive structures can actually strengthen governance and lead to improved outcomes for everybody, you know, for a more equitable arts centre, arts sector, for a sector that is actually really robust and strong and sustainable. So these sessions are really designed to empower you with the knowledge and skills that you need. We've got another, so I believe 4 sessions after this as well. We're going to break up the session into 2 parts. At the first part, we're going to hear from our brilliant guests individually, and then in the second part, we'll have more of a conversation with the speakers, and then some time for questions at the end, we hope. We also want this to be a really useful and positive session, so we ask everyone participating to please adhere to the following values that are going to guide our discussion. These are being respectful, being professional and genuinely engaging, deep listening, openness, not being judgmental, and trying to make this as safe a space as possible. If at any time during this conversation you find the discussions are too difficult or stressful, you're very welcome to take a break and then come back, because quite often conversations about change can be. Sorry for this very long intro, but it's really important that I also talk a little bit about the Shifting the Balance report that Diversity Arts Australia published in 2019. It was a report on cultural diversity in leadership with the Australian arts, screen and creative sectors. It's definitely due for a 2.0, which we've started planning for. Now, it's a really interesting report. What we did is we surveyed nearly 2,000 leaders from 200 of Australia's leading arts, screen and cultural organisations. And at the time, according to the Australian Human Rights Commission, 39% of the population, which was more than 1 in 3, were from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. And in our research, that meant first, second or third generation. And at that time as well, at the time that we published it, the Australia Council's own research had actually found that people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds had a higher than average live attendance and creative participation rate in the creative sector compared to the rest of the population. But despite this, what our research found was that approximately half, actually 51%, of the major cultural organisations in this country had no culturally and linguistically diverse representation, CALD representation at the leadership level. So no one at a board level, at an executive level, at a CEO level. And in fact, only 9% of nearly 2,000 leaders of our major cultural institutions were from culturally diverse backgrounds. And also that non-CALD Australians were 9 times more likely to occupy cultural leadership roles. than culturally diverse Australians. Now, when we do this research in the future, we'll be obviously changing the language, and that's a discussion for another time. But it's really important research to talk about, particularly because we know this research is one of the Creative Australia's motivations for this actual governance series, and also for this session, because if you don't have that leadership that represents or reflects the diversity and complexity of the population and the communities in which you're based or working, then it's very difficult, isn't it, to have genuinely organisations that represent those communities and have that connectedness. So that's a little bit of context, and we can come back to that, or we're going to pop in a link if we haven't already to that report. And so now I'm going to introduce Dr. Lily Brown. So Lily is a proud Gambungeri woman, scholar, facilitator, educator, director, and more recently executive director in the youth mental health space. She spent a decade and a half advocating for the self-determination of First Nations people, including supporting organisations in the arts and cultural sector to develop practices of cultural safety and racial literacy. And we've been really fortunate at Diversity Arts to work with Lily via our Fair Play program. Lily has worked to establish mechanisms of meaningful and sustainable governance that centre the critical knowledge and lived experience First Nations people bring to the table. She's a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and her qualifications include a doctorate from the University of Melbourne and a master's in politics and education from the University of Cambridge. The most profound learning ground for Lily, though, has been her work with First Nations young people and elders. So I'm going to pass the mic to Lily now, who'll talk about some sound principles of good governance and ground us with some examples. So welcome, Lily. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lena. Ginagay, hello. I'm Lily. I'm a fair-skinned Aboriginal woman wearing a white and black checkered dress with long brown hair, and I'm sitting in front of my bookcase, which my partner has beautifully colour-coded. Thank you again, Lena, for that introduction, and Adelaide and the broader team at Creative Australia, and thank you everyone for your time in joining this session over your very valuable lunch break today. Before jumping in, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the unceded lands of the Yari people, so in Ribibi, Broome, and I acknowledge their elders, past and present, and I also acknowledge all of the unceded lands on which you're calling in from. So in the next few minutes, I want to introduce, as Lena said, a few principles of governance that in my time working with organisations across sectors, in part, to support them to do better in their work with First Nations people, but also all communities. But before doing so, I thought it might be useful to define cultural safety. So what is cultural safety? The concept and practice of cultural safety actually emerged from a First Nations context. So it's an Indigenous concept in its origins. It was first coined by Māori midwives in Aotearoa, New Zealand in the mid-90s. If we fast forward 3 decades later, and it is promoted across the world, and particularly in Australia, as aspirational for organisations in supporting First Nations staff, external stakeholders and communities, but all people broadly in terms of feelings of safety in workplaces and in service delivery. So when we talk about cultural safety or safety on an individual level, it's about belonging, feeling valued, not having to compromise yourself in any moment, environment or interaction, and feeling like your whole self is reflected back to you in the way a service is delivered or an organisation engages with an individual. The idea of safety, though, is really complicated when the person seeking a service or being engaged with is from a historically marginalised group, or to reframe that, not from the dominant group, which in this country, as Lena kind of figured just before, is Anglo-Saxon or white, able-bodied, cisgendered men and women. So this idea of safety is complicated when you're, say, a First Nations person whose family has experienced generations or 2.5 centuries of oppression, starting with this concept of terra nullius, which is a concept which this nation is founded on, that this land, when the British first arrived, was a land belonging to no one. So terra nullius means a land belonging to no one. In the eyes of the British First Nations, people did not exist as people. We did not have laws or forms of governance that were recognisable to British understandings of those terms. So this is very profound. It's a profound erasure or non-recognition, and it has implications for the discussion that we're having today. So this country was founded on the idea that First Nations people had no laws and we had no governance. But in fact, and of course we did, and we still do, to think we didn't or we don't is to actually deny our humanity, our ways of doing things, our ways of knowing and being in the world. And to deny someone or a group of people their humanity is to render them inferior or lacking. And then to deny someone, but particularly First Nations people as a collective, their humanity is the linchpin of anti-Indigenous racism. And we have a lot of work to do because it's also, as I've said, the foundation on which this country has been built. So again, when we're having a discussion about First Nations people being meaningfully represented in boardrooms, or even to extend that to the example of the voice now in parliaments, we must also acknowledge that we as First Peoples have been denied participation in Western forms, or in this context, corporate governance for much longer than we have been considered integral to it. So there is that. And then the next question might be, why promote cultural safety and address the power gap at the board level, and particularly in terms of board representation? So increasingly, there is an appetite to understand how to do better in relation to First Nations people in the arts and culture sector. This is evidenced in the most recent National Cultural Policy Revive, and I, like Lena, want to commend Creative Australia on this incredible piece of work, which will no doubt have positive outcomes for First Nations creativity, but also for mainstream organisations who will now be supported to value that. And hopefully, sooner rather than later, this can also be extended to communities from migrant and culturally and linguistic diverse backgrounds, and for communities of colour sooner rather than later. So today's discussion is exciting because governance as the framework or mechanisms that scaffold the way organisations work encourage us to understand how the very foundations of our organisations and institutions can more deeply reflect the communities we often seek to represent, work with, or benefit. So this conversation is about structures and where power is located. And we get to talk about who makes the decisions in institutions and organisations and who informs those decisions. And at the very centre of that discussion is how to strengthen these structures, which is always exciting. Innovation in this way is always exciting. A principle that underpins the work that I do is that if you can get what you do right in relation to First Nations people, then your work with all people will inevitably benefit. And then the third bigger question, again in the context of today, which is also the first question you need to ask yourself as individuals, but also individuals representing organisations in doing this work, is why culturally safer organisations at all? I'm not going to answer this because it requires a really nuanced and complex answer, which I actually think will emerge more strongly over the next hour or so. So just quickly, some principles that I feel are real enablers of success when you're seeking to shift the structures of your organisation to better reflect the communities you represent and seek to benefit. The first principle is reframing mitigation of risk as community accountability. So when I work with organisations, whether a football club, a mining company, we don't generally work with mining companies, but when I, can imagine if I was advising them in this context, or an arts festival organisation, for example, are in crisis for doing the wrong thing in relation to First Nations people. Again, in my experience advising these organisations, and particularly boards, because usually this is escalated to board level, the most common response is risk mitigation. How do we minimise what's just happened? How do we decrease the reputational, financial, or legal risk? Often the action, when underpinned by the corporate governance idea of risk mitigation, further alienates or compromises First Nations communities. A more productive approach is for that board to actually ask, who are we accountable to? And in fact, if you have a First Nations board member, this is always what they'll be asking. It's usually the reason why they're on the board, so to help that organisation to actually be more accountable to First Nations people and communities. They'll be asking, how can we or this organisation be accountable to First Nations people? So instead of framing everything in terms of risk mitigation, try asking, who are we accountable to, and proceed from there. And often the action will look different, but in terms of the long term, It will strengthen the relationship that you have to the communities that you are responsible to. The second principle, which I think is really important when I'm talking to boards about working in this area, is supporting them to value relational ways of working, not just transactional. So ethical relationship building is action in this space. First Nations people, as my incredible friend, Jason Glanville, who's a Wiradjuri man, says, things in this space move at the speed of trust. Okay, so, and trust is built through relationship building. You cannot have trust if that investment isn't actually made in creating strong and meaningful relationships with the communities that you work with. And that just doesn't apply to First Nations people, but to all communities. That makes sense. In a corporate governance context, transactional ways of working are often valued. You can see that in kind of operations in terms of the way that sending an email and getting a timely response is often perceived as something that's really positive in terms of a way of working. Whereas I know if you're going to send an email to an elder, you're probably not going to get a response. If you want to work in terms of First Nations governance and relationship building, you've got to pick up the phone, and you can't just be counting on a 5-minute conversation. You've got to settle in, and you've got to talk to that elder about everything else that's going on in their life before they're willing to actually give you their time and energy, because that is so valuable. The third principle, and this is the last one before I hand it back over, is goodwill is not a resource. So goodwill is not a resource in this work. It needs to be given, but for cultural safety to be embedded in your organisation, it has to be understood as part of the fabric or the way you do things. It can't be the praxis of only culturally capable or well-meaning individuals. Quite often it's those culturally capable and well-meaning individuals who reach out to us, to myself and my colleague Genevieve at Garawa. When we're doing this work, they say, hey, we need your support to help our organisation. And what we know, if that individual is not supported by their management, leadership and board, they're going to burn out and they're going to leave, or they're going to invest all of this time in incredible initiatives that will never actually get up off the ground. So for First Nations people to be culturally safe, there must be in spaces and workplaces scaffolded by policies and processes that are not racist. And when I say this, I'm not only talking about interpersonal racism. So racism is interpersonal, but it's also institutional and it's structural. As I said, for 2.5 centuries, First Peoples' knowledges, ways of doing things, experiences, stories have been devalued and often denied in our existence. This is the very foundation of Australian nationhood. For cultural safety to exist, it is not just about or only about the relationship between or conduct of individuals. If this is where culturally safe praxis is located, like I said, then when that individual leaves, cultural safety lives with them. If you're committed to the cultural safety of First Nations people, but also all people, it has to be embedded in policies, in processes, and at all levels of the organisation, including at the board level. That's it from me, Lena. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lily. That was fantastic. There was so much to really think about. You did it in 10 minutes. That was incredible that you managed to put so much knowledge into 10 minutes and so much thought into and so many important concepts of thinking about, you know, things like reframing mitigation, risk mitigation as asking what, you know, who are we accountable to, and the importance of kind of building trust and that ethical kind of relationship building, but also how important it is to kind of not see racism at just the individual level, but also at a structural and systemic level. And that if we're going to do this work of changing our boards or changing or wanting to bring, you know, bring more diversity to the board, then we also need to do that scaffolding of bringing in policies and procedures and actual structural changes as well. I mean, I know that I haven't kind of in any way encapsulated everything that you've gone into, but there's a lot for us to kind of unpack in the second part in the conversation. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Lena.
And yeah, I like that, you know, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that as well, of the what we had spoken about the risk mitigation and community accountability a little bit a little bit further. I wanted to now hand over to Tasneem Chopra OAM, who is a cross-cultural consultant addressing issues of diversity, equity and inclusion through an intersectional lens within government, corporate, arts and community sectors. Tasneem is an anti-racism champion for the Australian Human Rights Commission and has been awarded a very prestigious Medal of the Order of Australia. Tasneem is a strategic advisor to the Victorian Public Service Commission, Fire Rescue Victoria, co-chair of the New South Wales Legal Aid External Anti-Racism and Inclusion Committee, and inaugural ambassador for Women of Colour Australia. She's an outgoing board member of the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, or ACME, the Collingwood Football Club Expert Panel on Anti-Racism, Ambulance Victoria, and former chair of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. Tasneem is also a former curator at both the Immigration Museum and the Islamic Museum of Australia. And she also hosts the podcast Strengths Unfold. And there's more, but I'm going to hand it over to Tasneem now. She's got a lot of experience of being engaged on boards, and she's actually also going to kind of talk about some of those critical issues in relation to this kind of into this conversation, and if it's, you know, possible to really create culturally safe boards if you're the only one, for example. So over to you, Tasneem.
Thank you so much, Lena, and thank you to Dr. Lily Brown as well for her comments. There was so much to unpack in that and so much valuable knowledge. My name is Tasneem Chopra. I'm a middle-aged woman of Indian descent, living here on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Bunurong Nation, the Kulin Nation, in what's known as Naarm, or Melbourne. I'm wearing a teal turban with a teal jumper and spectacles, which are, I think they're burgundy in their rim colour. So my gratitude for being a part of this panel to discuss topics that in many ways intersect with areas of great interest to me and passion, both professionally and personally. So the arts is something I hold very dear to my soul, but in the work that I do, I find it so necessary in the space of social impact. And for this reason, I find the deficit of leadership that represents the communities that will benefit and whose stories are not necessarily being represented to be a great source of frustration. There just isn't enough there. As Lena alluded earlier on, I have had board experience, and I've in the capacity of providing governance advice at various levels, and some of those boards have been relevant to the arts industry. So there is definitely that intersection there where I'm able to apply both my lens of cultural diversity and governance, and it's been an interesting journey. I have a lot of feelings about what that has been like, and a lot of opinions about how I think that entire environment can improve sort of systemically and seismically. There's a lot of change to be had. Where to start on this one? If we know that structurally and systemically the inequities that trickle down to communities are given in Australia and have been since colonisation, it's embedded in the way so much of what we experience, that inability to literally see the diversity in the room and respond accordingly, because there's a certain dominant template of what the industry should look like, and presumably what the audience of the industry looks like. So for me, that in itself, the premise there is flawed. Once you start actually dissecting the demographics of who we are, where we're from, and what kind of political lens is used to infuse the content of media and the content of art, then you can actually sort of, through my experience, see actually what's going on here. And to be that one person of diverse background on a board and try to rattle things and be the professional disruptor, as I've sometimes known myself to be, can be a lonely journey. There are small wins, but not seismic ones. And it's because you literally do feel like you're chipping away at this mammoth task of just making institutions see the broader picture. So for me, that's the great frustration. Having said that, there have been, the small wins that I've enjoyed have been being able to table something as simple as, what's our cultural diversity strategy for this organisation? Do we have one? And in non-arts organisations, I've seen that conversation be received, warmly, because nobody was even talking about it necessarily until I brought it up. And I guess the danger of that is then you become the emblematic representative for all things diverse all the time. And then you are seen as this pundit to be approached for all questions literally relating to cultural diversity, to Indigenous communities, to everything that's not, as they say, pale, male and stale. And that's not sizable. That's not sustainable. Okay, that's not sustainable. So the cultural competence training to me is a given. Making organizations sit with the discomfort of knowing that the way that they've been doing things, the way that they have been perceiving audiences and workforces as a monolithic entity is problematic, because we are diverse. But even within diversity, the diversity is not homogenous. Diversity is diverse by definition. It doesn't stop with gender, first of all, which tends to be the go-to for too many institutions in this country. Somehow they feel like if they're tracking on a gender equity strategy, which is essential, yes, it's not the complete picture. There is so much more to be done. And particularly within the arts, where I'm seeing such a deficit of, as Lena pointed out, or I think it might have been Adelaide, I apologise, in the very beginning, the domination of boards and governance levels in this country being so non-representative of the demographic of audience and population that we have here is a major missed opportunity. I mean, how do you plan, how do you agenda for an audience that you don't even have any proximity to? So if 50% of us almost are either born overseas or have a parent born overseas, that diversity not reflected in leadership within organizations is going to have consequences. It's having consequences in terms of the content you develop, the markets that you reach, and the impact that you have. So we know how powerful arts can be in being levers of social change, in touching hearts and touching minds and influencing change. But if that capacity to make that change and to increase awareness or increase knowledge is very strategically managed to not represent all of us, to me that becomes political. And seeing the development and the emergence of art on the fringes thrive in small doses, and that's probably where I go to get my my arts fix, so to speak, from practitioners and creatives who have to work outside the mainstream because the mainstream either doesn't see them, doesn't believe they're worthy, and certainly doesn't fund them. But more often than not, it's just invisibility. And there's almost, I find through, I guess, having really critically looked and been in the sector for the last 10 years, there's almost a system and a culture where those who have the talent and the ability to provide content that is diverse from communities, that is designed by community for community, are excluded from the opportunities that the mainstream systems create, because by definition, they're coded, they're privileged, and when opportunities exist for one to enter the other, they maybe lack the right tonality, they fill the form in differently for funding, they don't have the right sponsor, the right name, and so again, it's if they're lacking the so-called unspoken but necessary nuance to be advanced, to get up, and they don't have it, we fail to benefit from it. There are exceptions to that, obviously, and I there have been examples in maybe the last 12 months where I've seen, thankfully, more than one occasion of diverse creatives get up, but that's still maybe 5% in a pool that should be at least 50. So it's a long way to go, and I think there's education to be had on both sides. Yes, in terms of mainstream arts organizations recognizing the privilege that they have in providing opportunities even through funding rounds that somehow only will privilege and target those who are familiar with the system, know how to complete some of those applications forms, which can be so prohibitive. If you don't understand the language of the form, for example, you will fill it out wrong. You won't necessarily provide the right objective / aim / vision statement, or whatever it is that's required. And in no way is that a reflection of the product that you're going to deliver. It doesn't correlate with the talent that you have. And yet, because you miss one set of metrics, you miss out on the overall benefit. And I've seen that again and again over the last 5 to 10 years play out. And so for me, it's like, why questions that I'll have with funding bodies is rethink the way that you're approaching the public when it comes to, you know, issuing grants. Who is this form set out to benefit? I mean, if it's going to attract a potential applicant who has the resources to pay for a grant writer, compared to maybe an emerging community that doesn't have the resources, doesn't even know a grant writer per se exists as a thing to be able to contract, you have already created an uneven playing field before you even start. And that level of inequity just continues from that point. It continues from the application process, the assessment process, and ultimately in where those funds are allocated. So the system is broken. We need to rethink how we engage, who we engage, and that all can start to happen when the people who make the decisions about how things will run themselves reflect the communities they're trying to serve. So that's where leadership and diversity in leadership can be a benefit. But when you're the sole person on that organization or board and you do feel isolated, I have seen and I've heard from colleagues in similar positions to myself that organizations will retain you and think they've done the diversity win because they've got the brown person on the table. But the brown person can be quite isolated if they're not necessarily supported in new thinking, in new ideas. And you do sit with your imposter syndrome when you want to raise an issue that's quite counter to what everyone else is saying, or you are brave enough to raise it, but there's no one else to second you or support you. And it can chip away at you. It takes enormous strength of character to be able to continuously say, I disagree. I really want to push for this. I'm standing by my position without raising eyebrows or there she goes again. Like, and the response is very, sorry.
No, I'm so sorry. I could listen to you all day, but I have to give you, let you know that you've got like about 30 seconds.
Okay, that's fine. Creating environments on boards where people can come on and then supporting them once they're there. So providing the infrastructure to support people from diverse communities to be on boards, but not just accept that once they're on, that's it, but sustainably provide culturally safe environments. And I think that speaks so much to, or hopefully links in to what Lily was saying, is how you begin to start the process of change.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Tasneem. I like the idea. I like that title, Professional Disruptor, but also that both you and Lily spoke about, you know, the importance of changing systems and that it can't just be bringing in individuals. It's got to be about systems change. Wow, there was a lot to unpack there, which I think we will in the conversation. So this is the first kind of, we're going to talk now about kind of practical steps for how to, I guess, you know, introduce a more diverse and inclusive board. And the first question that I have is actually for Lily, but kind of follows on from what Tasneem was talking about, which is about kind of culturally unsafe boards. So Lily, you also spoke and gave us a fantastic education on what cultural safety is. When people talk about culturally unsafe boards, what do you consider to be a culturally unsafe board?
I think just reflecting on what Tasneem was sharing as well, it's when you know, increasingly boards are doing better at identifying positions on, you know, for First Nations people. And then that becomes the action. Actually inviting someone onto the board becomes the kind of signifier that organisation is a little bit more progressive in relation to First Nations stuff. But actually then, if that's one of the only actions that organisation has taken, what they're doing is passing on an incredible cultural load onto that individual. So that's one of the ways in which a board can be culturally unsafe. I think as well, there's if the cultural burden rests with First Nations people, and in parallel to actually recruiting someone to diversify a board, the cultural capability of other directors has not been built, that will always lead to a culturally unsafe board, because what you're doing then is it's almost like forcing an individual to be that radical, because they will always have to dissent when it comes to decisions being made in relation to First Nations people or people of colour. It will always be them. You know, if the decision being made isn't for the benefit of those communities, it will always be them having to raise their hand to say, hey guys, this isn't right. Whereas if you have a culturally capable or more culturally capable directorship, collective of people, then it becomes a shared decision making process where you have this collective group of people, they have a shared language and understanding, they're informed, and that's actually their duty. As board members, if you're making decisions, you should be informed about it. But quite often that load becomes the load of that First Nations person or person of colour as an individual director as part of that collective, and that's actually not okay. So when we're talking about scaffolding boards to actually be culturally safe, and we talk quite often, you know, there's that axiom that culture starts at the top, the culture of an organisation starts at the top. If these things are happening at the board level, absolutely guaranteed they're also happening across the organisation. You know, so boards need to get it right. They need to understand it's not just about having a bum on a seat. It's about supporting all of their directors to understand the importance of the work. And then what happens is the work isn't exceptional. It shouldn't be exceptional. This work should not be exceptional. You know, you shouldn't have a First Nations director as an exception to the rule. You should have them again valued as a part of the fabric of the organisation. And to do that, you need to, like I said, need to understand the implications of this work for your policies, for your processes. And kind of coming back to that, and again, the First Nations specific context as well. As First Nations people, we often talk about how we cannot, as individuals, represent the diversity of our communities. It's impossible. You know, so if you have a First Nations person on your board and you have other directors who haven't caught up yet, who haven't been supported to develop a shared language in relationship to this, then what other governance mechanisms are you going to put in place to ensure that that director is not burnt out, but to also ensure that whatever decisions that you make are actually implemented in a really sustainable and meaningful way? And one of the ways that you can do that is to pay First Nations people to be on advisory committees to boards while that board actually builds their cultural capability as a collective. So there are things that you can do as stopgap measures while the board actually ensures that they're attempting to make themselves culturally safer, because a board will never be culturally safe, but they can be culturally safer. And that's the aspiration.
Thank you so much. And Tasneem, you've already spoken about, you know, being the only one as well on a board. So this is a very, you know, I think very relevant to people of colour as well. These, you know, kind of being the only one and feeling obliged almost to have to represent, you know, everyone when you are the only one. You talked, Tasneem, about the importance of kind of training and education, but what other kind of structural changes or practical actions can boards take to work towards making culturally safer spaces? As Lily says, we can never guarantee cultural safety, but working towards always creating culturally safer boards and organizations.
I should start off that I don't think I've ever nodded so much as I did as when Lily just gave her response just now. I feel like I need a neck massage at this point. But I do want to point out that in terms of beyond the one-off cultural training and appointing the brown person on the board to be really crude, I suppose, there's that idea of, and this again feeds to what Lily was saying, is ensure that you apply that cultural diverse matrix over aspects of what you do everywhere. It's not just when we have a function, it's how do we recruit? How do we retain? What are we planning for? Who are we engaging? What does our market strategy look like? In all those different areas, that lens should be consistent. It shouldn't just be a one-off. It shouldn't just be for Diwali or Hanukkah or, you know, Eid or for Christmas. It should be like diversity is not just a Christmas, it's for everything. It's about being consistent in that lens and embedding it into BAU, not as an afterthought, but in how you do.
Spot on. We have been working with organisations over the last few years, and this is where we've worked a lot with Garawa, and developed with them equity action plans. I mean, they can have lots of different names, justice, equity action plans, and we find that they're a lot, you know, kind of that they're all about, I guess, what you're just talking about, Tasneem, like really embedding into the organisation kind of changes and structures across all areas, like from audience development to community engagement to governance. And I think, you know, you need those really practical kind of goals, and you know, you've got to have targets as well to kind of do this work and hold yourself and your organisation to account.
But I should just quickly add, if I can, when we do make that ask, it should be done in tandem with having people and resources within an organisation that are also representative of those communities, because it's so much more logical and intuitive to get the tone right when you're planning for diverse initiatives, or even initiatives that are going to target all communities, which include diverse communities, when there are diverse people on board who do that marketing, when they do that reach. So when the people who are trying to incorporate and engage are represented in the people who are doing the engaging, it's not rocket science. You get it right, that you get the tone right. Yeah. So co-design is simply what this is. It's ensuring that that's built into what you do, so that whenever you are creating and promoting product, if your workforce is representative of who your targeted group is, then by definition you're bleeding co-design into that process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And I think Australia's a rarity in the way that when I've sat on panels internationally, like they're always really shocked by the number of people who don't have any lived experience who are consulting in, you know, on issues, for example, of disability or cultural diversity or First Nations. It just doesn't, it's really, it's always very shocking. Lily, I was once told when I was advocating for more cultural diversity on a particular board that they just couldn't find anyone in the entire state from a person of colour, migrant background, in the entire state who would actually have the expertise and connections needed to be on this particular arts board. Sorry, have to have a laugh there. But so how do you feel? And I know First Nations people's experiences are very different, but how do you feel when you hear organisations say, we just can't find anyone with the experience that comes from a First Nations background or a diverse background to join their board?
Look, I think that for me, as an Aboriginal woman, when I know that we make up 3.5% to 4% of the population, you know, of course there's a capacity issue, but I think in that comment there's also the assumption that actually as First Nations people or people of colour and from refugee and migrant backgrounds, we don't have the knowledge, experience or skills to do the work. And what that does then is foregrounds or values people who might have, say, qualifications rather than lived experience, and that's a problem. But also we do have the qualifications. I have a bloody, you know, master's from Cambridge, and I know a lot of other First Nations people who are absolutely, you know, front up in terms of their Black excellence, and they might or might not have qualifications, but they're absolutely overqualified to be on most boards, to be honest. And so it's not our issue, it actually becomes the organisation's issue. They're employing frameworks of understanding that limit what they can see, what they can and cannot see, and that's their loss, you know. So I think, again, as First Nations people, we are asked to do a lot, and like we are a very small proportion of the population. So it is about organisations finding really sustainable and meaningful ways to engage with us as individuals and communities. But to say that, yeah, we're not qualified, there's just no excuse. That's not an excuse.
Tasneem, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, yeah, high five. decolonize the skills matrix. It's proximity to whiteness is not the defining win that you need to hire somebody. Look at interview substance over style. There's so many ways in which we're just so predicated on determining what the right fit is. What is it, the term? We're so obsessed with the cultural fit, we forget about the value of a cultural add, right?
Yes.
So think about diversifying your thought processes. By diversifying your table, think outside the square when it comes to the way that you recruit. And it's so much of the problem, and this has been my new pet hate and bugbear, is the problem of HR in organizations, which inherently is not diverse in who makes the choices. Start diversifying HR and you will start seeing a diversification in how you recruit and who's recruited. But as long as it looks the same, it's got a very vanilla structure and a very colonial sort of framework of the way they've been doing hiring since 1953. Of course, you're not going to get a diverse cohort. So the problem is in the who's at the table.
And just adding to that too, Lena, what Tasneem has said, it also speaks back to what you were saying, Tasneem, around grant applications. If those frameworks are being used to be able to identify who is or is not available to be on a board, and then they're extended as well to who is or is not valued as a part of, in terms of grant applications, it's very obvious actually that the culture of that organisation is being set at the top, and then what that's excluding in practice in terms
100%.
of what's valued and not valued, which is again a real loss. It's not just a loss for organizations, it's a loss for audiences, and not just Black and brown audiences, but all audiences actually, to be able to access the diversity and beauty of that. It's a shame.
Yeah, because it's about really, if we are really going to have a sustainable and robust sector, then it is all audiences, then it is all communities. It is that connectedness that's so important, and that only really arts and culture can bring in the way that they do, in the way that it does. I feel like we might have already kind of answered this, but I'm wondering, I think we've already talked about how organisations can reduce barriers that have locked out historically marginalised communities. Would you agree, or do you want? Is there more that we want to say about that? Because I'm aware of.
Yeah, Lena, just really practically, and I think increasingly there is a deeper understanding of the importance of this, but you have to pay for lived experience.
Yes. Well, why do arts boards not pay? Why do we not pay? Yes. Okay.
And it's, in a way, I think the arts sector is commendable. There's so many people really slogging it for not much money, but that's an issue. And we don't want to legitimise that, because what that's an extension of actually is successive governments devaluing the arts and culture sector. People need to be paid accordingly, actually, and that needs to be extended to diversification of boards. Because quite often as well, when you've got diverse board members who are not coming from intergenerational wealth, that money is really important, and what that enables is their sustainable engagement. So if you've got elders or community people who are not, don't have access to that capital, to be able to support them financially is one of the most practical things you can do in terms of diversifying your board.
I think you're right, that's the way we approach community-led knowledge and information is really, there's almost a hierarchy in that we need it, because without it we can't actually produce the content. By we, I mean the system, and yet we wouldn't pay for it because it's a community, right? It's that whole idea of, well, by giving us your knowledge, we will be able to help your people. But at the same time, they would really remunerate a consultant very, very well for the same information, who would probably go to community to get that information anyway, to be able to deliver it. So like the system, again, it's skewed towards privileging those who have a greater proximity to, in resemblance and in background and in experience to leadership. So, and I'm saying this as a consultant, I know. As a consultant, I'll get paid to do something, but when people want my input and talent from a cultural lens, it's considered I'm doing my community a favor. Yep. So yeah, it's racist, really.
So much wisdom, and very practical as well about kind of needing to remunerate people and rethink the you know, rethink that in terms of, you know, when people, when that it is a barrier to a lot of people who, as Lily said, are not, you know, kind of wealthy necessarily to kind of have that time and do the amount of work that's required to be on an arts and cultural board. I think we'll go to our final topic, unless Tasneem, you wanted to say anything else about ways of reducing barriers, but I feel like we'll probably talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to bring that into the last section.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So our final topic and question is about what needs to change and shift for boards to be more inviting spaces. So I think we have already addressed that, but we're hoping that this will be a little bit of a blue sky kind of question, and we can spend a little bit of time with it, that it will be a bit inspiring for you as people on boards, aspiring to be on boards, or people responsible for recruiting for boards or organizations to, you know, build more robust and kind of equitable organizational cultures and structures. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we would need to change for boards to be places where people from diverse and historically marginalized backgrounds would actually be knocking at the doors of your boards and saying, we really want to join your boards. Like, so I wanted to first maybe go to Tasneem, because Lily ended the last one, so we'll stay.
Yeah. Sure.
So I think, you know, if what would it take, you know, if you can imagine this amazing future where we have, you know, kind of really decolonized boards and structures of organizations and the way that we operated, you know, what would that kind of look like? And, you know, what would that look like to have actually people from historically marginalized backgrounds who were knocking at the door and wanting to join boards and feeling valued on boards and not feeling exhausted, as often is what we hear when underrepresented people from underrepresented communities join boards.
Okay, well, if we're looking into the future through a utopic lens, I would say you wouldn't be the only person of colour on a board. There would be more than one of you. So there's that. You would be entering an organisation that had a cultural diversity strategy, had cultural competency training as a given for all members, including those from diverse backgrounds, had a record and commitment to providing culturally diverse content as core business, not as just on special occasions. And it had a cultural safety plan as well in place for all the members that were going there. So, but beyond that, you could also see that diversity, cultural diversity bled through the organisation. So not just at leadership, but at entry level, middle management, senior management, throughout the organisation, not just at entry level, which it tends to be. So you would see yourself reflected throughout the organisation, both in terms of the people and also the content of what it delivered.
And does that resonate with you, Lily?
It does. I mean, when I imagine best case scenario, you know, it's, you got people of colour and First Nations people on boards and they're not there for that. You know, they're on mainstream boards and they're there for everything that they bring. You know, like most Aboriginal people also have a degree in accounting, or, you know, like stuff to bring. We're complex humans, and quite often this kind of marking of us as very particular bodies or lived experiences denies that complex humanity. You know, as intersexual beings, and when I say intersectional, not intersectional beings, everyone is that. You know, we're not just one thing. And yet what happens sometimes, I think, is, when you're pegged as one thing, what the rest of you can't be valued in that context. And so, affording that complex humanity. And again, you know, when I talk about racism, I'm really talking about the way that it functions structurally and institutionally. Of course, also interpersonally, but sometimes I think it's almost too easy to locate racism in the interpersonal. It's very visible in that way. What we also need to be attending to is how it functions structurally and institutionally. And again, to deny someone their full complex humanity That's textbook racism. And when you've got structures that enable that, that's a problem. So breaking down those structures, actually saying, you know, you have these extremely diverse boards that really do reflect the communities in which arts orgs are seeking to represent and work with. And people aren't diversity hires. They're there because of their full complex humanity and the skills that they bring, in addition to their lived experience, which is what is afforded to other board members who are white, able-bodied, quite often men. So I think there's that. And then there's all the other things, you know. I think it's, if we're really valuing the beauty and brilliance and creativity of diverse communities, that just needs to be reflected across the organisation and valued. It's a no-brainer, you know, and for it not to be valued is a problem. So let's start valuing it. What does that really mean? It means, when we're talking about value, we're talking about resourcing. You know, we're talking about moving this work beyond the exception to it being normalised. It's just a normalised part of the practice of an organisation. When people do the work, they're just doing their jobs. It's a part of the KPIs, or it's a part of their position descriptions. Imagine, in addition to board members, when we're talking about decolonising that skills matrix, imagine if it wasn't just, okay, what are your financial capabilities? What are your connections across the philanthropic sector? Also, what is your sensibility in regard to advocating for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and other diverse communities? You know, and that question's asked not just of non-Indigenous or white board members, it's asked of Tasneem, it's asked of me. You know, what does that mean actually? And again, that if we're extending a framework where the lived experience and full complex humanity of board members is understood, then people will also understand that, yeah, I might be able to speak as a fair-skinned Aboriginal woman who's also belongs to Gumbaynggirr country, but I can't speak on behalf of Yolngu up in far north East Arnhem Land, you know? So there's violence in that. It's violence in actually thinking that I could. So what does that actually look like for us to be able to come onto these boards and to be valued in everything that we are?
Have there been examples of really good boards and structures that, you know, boards or alternative boards that you've both been on where things have really worked well?
I've had the opportunity on one of the boards that I was on in the past, where the board was invited to participate in this program, which is very it is very mainstream. It's called the Board Observership Program. So some people might be familiar with it. Essentially, it's a pathway for people, I think, between the ages of 25 to 40, so predominantly younger than traditional board-aged people, presumably, and it skills them up on what to experience and what to prepare for to be on a board. So it's not the Australian Institute of Company Directors Board course, but it's something in parallel to that that's, I think, more affordable and more accessible. But the idea is that it enables people to participate in a program that can be, I think, on and off for maybe 12 months, done with support of their employer at the time. And what they do is, at the end of the program, they get an opportunity to apply to sit on a board of their choice as an observer, right? And my interaction with the entity that was running this program was, they approached me not because of the board that I was on, but because of the work that I do in cultural competency, and said, we recognize that we don't have a lot of diverse participants in this program, culturally diverse specifically, and we would really like to change that. And so this, I mean, it was obviously well intended. They wanted me to be able to promote their initiative to others. So I was happy to do that. And in the process of doing that, I found out in subsequent years, people that I'd recommended or referred it on to did apply, get through, got onto a board. And one of the benefits of the observership program is that at the end of your term, where you are an observer on the board has the opportunity to retain you. So then you can actually get fast-tracked onto a board and to get that experience. And in some cases, I saw that happen. Again, few and far between. And I appreciate the call out from the training body to ask me to share this with my people, which I was happy to do. But I mean, again, it's like, I'm not the solution to diversifying approaches. I don't have all the people's numbers on my WhatsApp group, so I just can only provide it to who I know. But it was a start. and it was great to see, and it's good to see. I'm no longer with that particular board anymore, but I've seen and I know of participants who've been through that program from diverse backgrounds who've said, if I had not known about that, I wouldn't have got on, and I don't think I'd be in the board now in my 30s. And and they're the only person of color on the board. So then it does, I'm like, let's hope that they can stay on the board, that there's some culturally safe environment at play to keep them there. But it's a new iteration. Let's see how it goes.
I think for me, I have the privilege of being on boards of Aboriginal community controlled organisations. And quite often those boards are made up of Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal allies. And when I think about cultural safety, to be on a board of an Aboriginal organisation where corporate and financial governance are overarched by cultural governance is a real pleasure, because I front up, as Gumbaynggirr Lily, but also again, all the other parts of me are recognised. So actually more than ever in that board meeting, I'm just like, I'm a woman, or I'm a mother, or it's actually because what's normalized is being a First Nations person, that then is not the thing that's focused on. And it's a real pleasure as well, because on one of the boards we have the most exceptional non-Indigenous accomplices who would fulfill the dream board matrix every time, decolonized or otherwise. And yet what they're doing is, in their conduct, you can tell, is they're privileged to be in the space. They're privileged, actually. They feel privileged to be on a board where First Nations is first, and they're a non-Aboriginal person there, and they're a part of contributing to a really strong functioning of corporate, financial, and cultural governance, which is really beautiful. What that tells me, though, is that that's also transferable. If you can have First Nations organisations having really functioning and strong cultural and corporate governance, then that can also occur actually in mainstream organisations. Mainstream organisations, again, just have to begin to understand and articulate what cultural governance looks like in that context. There's nothing more beautiful than having a board meeting out on country, to actually ground yourself and to connect as well, to see that relationship building as action. What happens then is that you have a really strong and formidable board who can tackle extremely tricky issues and still be standing at the end of it. Because conflict is generative. There's all of these really important things that are put in place as like the foundation from which we proceed to engage with one another. And in corporate governance, that is absolutely not valued. And if in a boardroom where cultural governance is not articulated, and not just First Nations cultural governance, but cultural governance more broadly, say like the culture of the organisation is not articulated, then again, what you have is relationship building as action as exceptional. And I keep on saying that because corporate governance, when those things occur in those spaces, it's by accident, it's not by design. So again, what it's about is like, how do we actually move to ensuring that boards function in a way where these things are not accidental? You have chairs who understand that board members who know each other, not just in a boozy, expensive dinner the night before the board meeting, but actually in the board meeting, in the moment, are supporting one another and getting to know one another. That's a key ingredient to safety, not just cultural safety, but the safety of everyone. So, and it also moves away from this idea that to be professional, you have to be composed. You can't let too much of yourself there. And I think that's also, I often think about this idea of conflict of interest. The conflict of, I know everyone in the Black community in that way. There's very rarely can I be sitting in a corporate room and someone say, oh, does anyone know so-and-so? That's relationality. Whereas in a corporate context, that's really framed as conflict of interest. So how do we ensure that these things still exist? We have good probity, good corporate governance, but that actually really informs the importance of relationships. It informs ideas of safety. It informs those kind of that diversity and the beauty in that. And it's shifting the way that we do things and understanding that corporate and cultural governance do not have to sit in tension. They are functioning all across the country in really generative ways, including in our Aboriginal community controlled sector. And, you know, we've got beautiful organisations like Mugabala Books in the arts and cultural sector who were also mentioned in the Revive policy. And that's what they do. They have an all Aboriginal board, they have a non-Aboriginal CEO, they have incredible non-Indigenous accomplices at that organisation supporting the work that they do. You know, this is generative work if we can get it right.
And we have a lot to learn from the way that these, the way that First Nations, these kinds of First Nations boards are set up, that we can take into other spaces and other, other use for other board structures. We have a question from Manjusha, and it says, it's unpaid labour and it's not fair that I have to consult and share my cultural knowledge and connections and lived experience. Why is it a standard and expectation that board members are there in a voluntary capacity? And I might hand that to Tasneem.
Yeah, I hear you, Manjusha. If you're talking within an arts context, I would, I've had the same conversation myself in the past. Why is this not paid? Whereas on other, government, even government funded entities, board representation is paid. And the answer was literally, but this is how it's always been. Which is like the answer to so much in this country, really. But if I was to take a deep dive, I would say it's because it's devaluing of arts. I mean, it was not long ago that governments in this country defunded arts radically and cut it because they just don't see value. They just don't see the value of it. If they don't see the value of funding arts, how are they possibly going to see the value of funding an opinion about arts? Not being cynical, but I think that is why there is now a lot of legacy culture of not funding, not remunerating that kind of advice. Whereas in any other capacity, I can assure you, if you were advising on aspects of emergency services or infrastructure or education or something else that was defence, you would be paid. So maybe someone less cynical than me can answer that, but that's all I have.
Look, I don't know if I'm less cynical, but I also, I think that, again, historically, if we think about who has sat on boards, more privileged people have been able to sit on boards and not be paid. And now we've got this push to diversify boards. And what that means is you've also got to pay people. Like it's, again, that goodwill, benevolence is not a resource. Previously, it has been. You've got people from corporate sectors sitting on small arts org boards because it looks good, like it's a good way of them to exercise or demonstrate their support of community or, volunteering. But again, we know, and more the discourse says that even the volunteering sector is unequal, because to volunteer, you have to be able to have the resources to do so. The more we move to diversify, the more we have to think about what are the enablers of that? How do we enable it? And this is it. And, feeling very privileged to be on this call, which has been facilitated by one of our main funding bodies for the arts and culture sector. This is something that if this beautiful piece of policy is actually going to be implemented, these are serious questions we need to be asking. Now, if we're going to diversify, how are we actually supporting individuals to sustainably be in these power holding positions? It needs to be part of it.
It's all interrelated. I mean, when you have board members, when you have board members who are sitting on 7-figure salaries, sitting on a board because they enjoy the arts and they love it, and they're philanthropists and it's great. Then on that board, you've also got maybe a single mother from the outer suburbs who's not in that position. Having an unfunded position on a board, it can make the difference of joining or not. Yeah. And that is going to trickle down into what informs content and conversation and direction and policy. So start diversifying the way that, or start remunerating the positions there, because it's going to attract talent that's actually going to diversify your content and your bottom line. But that's not happening because, as you say, it's historically the people sitting at the table for an entity of arts have been quite privileged and enjoy it, and they come to it with good intent, and they do love the arts, but it's not about shifting the needle. It's about embracing more opportunities for them, their cohort, their friends, and their sector, and that's not representative. So that is really problematic, and that is something that I've run into on multiple experiences. Being that one person who didn't look like the rest, or come from the same background as any of the rest.
And if you're in a salaried position and your employer actually supports you to be on a board, you can be on that board and not have to be paid. It's part of your job, you know. But actually, again, in the arts and culture sector, if we're talking about lived experience beyond the color of your skin, then it's actually also very rare that you get someone who can commit to full-time creative work and actually be sustainably paid. You know, so and I know that this is an issue that increasingly is going to be addressed in a policy context, but right now, to be creative and to want to be paid for it is to be it's precarious. It's precarious labor. It's precarious. It needs to be addressed, actually. And again, this is when we say, what if you can do if you can get right what you're doing in relation to First Nations people or people of colour communities, then it's going to benefit everyone. It benefits everyone.
So Lily and Tasneem, how can we bring the principles of justice, equity, diversity and inclusion to the agenda of every board meeting so that it's actually in the DNA of the organisation? It's just so embedded.
I don't know, just maybe the boards are known for, adhering to skills matrices quite enthusiastically. Maybe we can decolonize the skills matrix, as I mentioned earlier, and what kinds of cultural diversity are you embedding as core within the way that you recruit board members? How are you going about it? If you're not getting it, why are you not getting it? And again, going back to HR or to their marketing strategies, how have they historically been sourcing their directors? Has it been from the standard, AICD group chats, or are they doing something a little bit more creative? Who could they lean on to think outside the square in terms of, is it Diversity Australia? Is it, who is it going to be? But just putting it in their heads that the way that they've been doing it is not sustainable in the long term if Australia is advancing in its demographic, but they're not advancing in the way that they in the way that they plan and in the way that they agenda both content and people culture.
Thanks, Tasneem.
I agree. And I mean, again, if we talk about culture of organisations, there's also cultures of boards, and if we're talking about principles of justice and equity, then the culture of the board needs to align with that. And if that means some people need to step down, then that's a conversation that board needs to have, because quite often, people need to step down if you want to bring someone on. But then also saying, look, we're going to set this benchmark, and that benchmark includes you as board members understanding what decolonisation is, you as board members understanding what racism is and how it manifests interpersonally, but also structurally, given boards are structures, and institutionally. You guys, if you want to be effective board members at this organisation, you must understand that, because we're going to be implementing a cultural strategy, or we're going to be doing work in the First Nations space. And to do that successfully, we need to have a board who's fit for purpose. So actually reviewing the board and saying, are you fit for purpose? What are you here for? And if you're here because you enjoy the arts, but you're not willing to do the training and to skill up to actually value add to this organisation, you need to think about leaving. And that's really hard to have those conversations. It's so hard. It's hard to have those conversations if it's incumbent on a CEO who has to report to that board. Boards are structured in a way in relation to organisations where it's really can compromise people. For a CEO to say, hey guys, you're the ones that can hire or fire me, but I want you to do this, or I don't think you're fit for purpose at the moment. So there needs to be chairs, not just having the First Nations or the person who comes from a refugee and migrant background as an identified board member, having them as the chair. Setting the organisation at the top, setting the culture of the board. What that's going to require is a little bit of movement.
Yeah. Very powerful words, very powerful words, and we've got some really good questions as well. We've got Sarah Henneveld who's asking, It is, sorry, I'm going to ask these questions, but you know, I'm just thinking about it when you are, especially for small to medium not-for-profits, and what you were just saying, Lily, like, yeah, the stress on the CEO in that role when the board is their employer, but also, you know, you're not a huge organization. Like, it's so, it is really difficult and hard, but definitely, you know, there's so many good, you know, it's hard work, but it's the work that you have to do if you're in these roles. And that, you know, if we're in these roles, then, you know, particularly for us in the not-for-profit sector, it's there for, we exist for community, so we must, you know, do this hard work. And I love that, like, if we have this decolonial skills matrix that I'm going to be following up Tasneem about, then, you know, using that as the way as well, which is really kind of a powerful thing, because then it's not on you as the individual, it's a structural thing. We've got this matrix and these are the things, and you're actually factoring in. And in all the matrices I've looked at, I've never seen, how did you say it? You said it better, Lily, you know, like the cultural stuff factored in. Like, if people are, you know, the culture of a board, like you're bringing, you know, the values, you don't really have values in skills matrices that I've looked at, you know, like, so I do think, you know, rethinking that is a powerful opportunity, for change. And then you can use that as well, which I love doing as well. I like to say, oh, look, we've set up this structure. It's not me, it's the structure. You have to do this. You have to act ethically. Sorry.
Sometimes it's easier to lean on that. When I mean, if it's government, you can say, well, look, it's the strategy. It's the government endorsed strategy. We've all signed up to it. It's a statutory thing.
Yes.
You know, gender equity's got it. They've got it right. They've managed to get a strategy and an equity for government-led organizations. They have to now be transparent about pay equity, about about hiring processes, about all of that stuff. So let's extend that. Now, this will literally be my epitaph, but like, diversity doesn't stop at gender. Can we get it into culture as well? Can we ensure that commitment and that rigor to cultural equity and inclusion and representation is carried through the organization, and make it embedded as a quota? Can I use the word target? I don't know if it's a dirty word.
I love it. I love, because if we don't have targets, no one,
if
like,
it's not measured, it's not done, right? That's what they say.
Yeah, I reckon.
So put it in there.
And actually,
I
was just going to say, Tasneem, and actually, if you have a matrix that accounts for that, then it does serve like a quota. You know, when a new appointment is being made, you're looking at that intersection and going, okay, we need an accountant, but we also need a Torres Strait Islander woman. So let's find a Torres Strait Islander woman who's an accountant. You know, it's really important actually in guiding the culture of the board, but increasingly as well, and I keep coming back to this, the new, you know, policies that have been created in the arts and culture sector, these are levers. You need to be leveraging these. CEOs now, they need to read these policies, and they need to understand actually like what communities they are accountable to, given the shift in the way the sector is now doing things. And that shift is going, if you do not align yourself with that shift and you do not understand its implications for your organization, you're not going to get funded.
Yep.
It goes beyond the moral imperative. You're not going to get the money.
Yeah, 100% on board with that. Like I said, we do it for other things. Let's do it for this as well.
I just, on that, I really want to, I know I mentioned the Creative Equity Toolkit, but there's some links we're going to put in the chat. It's a really practical resource, and it's designed to be, it's action based. So one of the main sections is governance, and there's 2 actions in there that are really relevant to this conversation, which are how to develop diverse leadership and how to recruit and retain diverse talent. And it actually kind of has guides, it has templates, it has you know, all probably not as radical yet as we need, that Tasneem's talked about, but there's matrices and all sorts of things. So let's so check that out. There's a few really good questions in the chat. So where should I start? Maybe
Lily can do the top one. How's that?
Yeah. Okay. The top one or the second one? Sarah. Okay. So Sarah says, I'm interested in how we can make the opportunities more accessible for First Nations to be represented in the artwork across our program. We are trying paid workshops and web forms to make these more culturally safe and inclusive. And there are many more, and any more suggestions we could do to make these more accessible? There was discussions about nuanced and coded application processes. How do we start to unpack these in a way that is appropriate? Thanks, Sarah.
Sarah, what a massive question. And again, I come back to what I mentioned before, Jason Glanville's idea that things move at the speed of trust. I think, again, you know, there's all of this kind of discourse in the sector around the importance of this work. You can't put the cart before the horse. You need to take a slow and sustainable approach. You need to think about First Nations staff, because if you hire a First Nations person and that person feels culturally safe and supported, it's not just them, they're bringing the community with you. If you have one Aboriginal person vouching for you as an organisation, it opens up a lot of doors. On the other side, flip the coin, if you've got one Aboriginal person not vouching for you as an organisation, that has implications too. So really thinking through, all right, how can, yes, the workshops, yes, all of those things that you mentioned, but also demonstrating as an organisation that you're investing in First Nations communities, and not just as bums on seats, but really truly in the ways that we do things, First Nations ways of doing, being, valuing, all of that stuff. And over time, what you will find is First Nations people will engage with you and want to make content for you. You know, it's a slow process, and yeah, trying to really actually articulate quite a targeted strategy in relation to that along those lines, and then thinking through how you resource that is an important part of it. But there's no quick fix. I wish I could just say to you, this is what you need to do, ABC, but it's about building trust, and all relationships are tricky. You know, if they weren't, you'd be veering into transactional territory. If you say you really want to value ethical relationships, then sometimes there's stops, there's starts, sometimes there's breakups, sometimes there's fights. You have to say, okay, this is what we're welcoming actually. The messy complexity and nuance and beauty actually of what it really means to build relationships with a community. And it's tricky, it takes time. But if you want to do it, if you want to get it right, that's what you have to do.
Thanks, Lily. We have about 1 minute because then I have to wrap up. So there's a really good one, which is so hard. I don't know if you can answer it in 1 minute, which is there's no one on your board. What if there's no one on your board that's an ally or an accomplice, and no one who'll stick out their head to be the one? How do you bring about change in a context like this without risking your own livelihood as a CEO, just like Lily pointed out? Can you do it in a minute?
Make a business case. Use the data sets that exist, which are available from either Diversity Arts Australia or abroad from Britain, from the British Arts Council, that demonstrate when you actually have a strategy that engages diverse audiences, the bottom line of the organisation does better, both in terms of outreach and profit. When you can actually, sadly, actually make a fiscal imperative and link between the gains of cultural inclusion, people pay attention. Sad, but true. So make the fiscal sale, make the business case for it, and then that might ensue in a culture change.
Thank you. We've got 2 others, but I don't think we've got time for them, unless either of you want to type in something or have a quick response. Go. This has been such a great conversation. I need to be as fast as I can. Before we close, we also like to do surveys. We're constantly trying to reflect on the work we're doing, and strengthen it. And we'd love to hear back from you. So it's a really short survey, and we give the feedback to the panelists, and it's, you know, de-identified and confidential, but Creative Australia will also be getting that information. So if you have time, please can you fill in the survey that we're putting in the link. And I just wanted to close today's session by really sincerely thanking our amazing speakers, Dr. Lily Brown and Tasneem Chopra, for sharing such valuable knowledge and experience for this session, and just, you know, incredible to be part of this session. And I hope you took away some practical kind of ideas and inspiration to strengthen your boards and also your own roles on boards. Thank you so much to Creative Australia for leading this project, and particularly Adelaide Reef, Emerald Dunn Frost and Adam McGowan. A massive thank you and acknowledgement to our series producer, the brilliant Dr. Gurkam Ajaralu. Thanks to our Auslan interpreters, Tiani and Kelly, and our live captioners too. And importantly, thank you so much to all of you for being here today and joining this conversation and taking the time. It's really important, and we value you being here, and it's kind of, it keeps us going. So thank you so much. Is there anything I missed? If not, then I will say thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you at the next conversation.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. So